and welcome to tonight's event to discuss the case for economic growth. My name is Oliver Hartwig and I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. It is great to see so many of you here. This must be the largest event we've held so far. Special welcome to the members of the New Zealand Initiative who are with us tonight. I see Neil Pavia-Smith from Forsyth Barr, Mark Radcliffe from Chorus, Nicola Willis from Fonterra, and Catherine Isaac of Aurora Partners. Welcome to you all and thank you for your support. Without our members, we couldn't hold events such as this one tonight. Tonight's discussion is about our new publication on economic growth, authored by my colleagues Dr. Eric Crampton and Janisa Jerem. The book explains why we believe economic growth is good for us in many ways, and Eric will speak about it in a minute. After Eric has made his case for growth, we then want to explore what role economic growth should play in policy making. Is it the one defining goal of politics, or is it just one among many competing objectives? Or should we discard it as a goal altogether? We'll find out the answer to these questions from three up-and-coming MPs. We're grateful that they have taken their time out of their busy schedules to debate with us tonight, so welcome to our event. Let me introduce our political panel briefly. I won't do it from left to right, nor from progressive to conservative, but simply in the alphabetical order of their first names: Chris, David, and James. That's not only because the New Zealand Initiative is a non-partisan think tank, but mainly because we do not believe in such often meaningless labels. We don't want to label your politics, gentlemen, we rather want to hear what you have to say. So, starting with Chris. Chris Bishop is a nationalist MP based in Lower Hutt who was first elected to Parliament in last year's election. If you are a regular at our events, you would also know that Chris is an award-winning debater who helped us adjudicate the initiative's next generation debates in the past. Tonight he's here not to adjudicate, but to debate, and we are glad to have you with us. Please welcome Chris Bishop. Chris is joined by Dr. David Clark, who is the MP for Dunedin South and Labour's spokesperson for economic development. As David and I found out when we first met, he's one of the very few politicians in New Zealand with whom I could have a fluent conversation in German, because he lived in Germany twice. And if that's not enough to make David an unusual politician, he came to Parliament in 2011 having completed a circuitous route, having run a residential university college, worked as a Presbyterian minister, spent too long as a student, as he says himself, and done time as a Treasury analyst. Please welcome Dr. David Clark. And last but not least, we have James Shaw with us tonight. James is a list MP for the Green Party and entered Parliament last year. He is a party's spokesperson for economic development, commerce, trade and investment, tourism, small business, sustainable business, SOEs, open government and electoral reform. And because that's obviously not enough to keep James busy, who prior to politics worked as a consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers and HSBC, he is also a candidate for the co-leadership of his party. So please welcome James Shaw. Let me now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Eric Crampton, and after him we will hear, as I mentioned, in alphabetical order from Chris, David, and James, before opening it up to your questions. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eric Crampton.
Thanks everybody for coming. Apart from longer life expectancy, better health, improved education, a cleaner environment, better opportunities for our children, and a happier country, what's economic growth really ever done for New Zealanders? You might be surprised to hear that economic growth fundamentally lies behind every one of those. The usual story is that there's trade-offs where, well, you can't get better environmental quality because we have the growth imperative, but in reality, economic growth is what lets us afford improvements to all of the kinds of things that we care about, all the things we find valuable. And that's one of the reasons that Janisa Jerem and I wrote this short report on economic growth. There's been growing complacence about economic growth in New Zealand around productivity growth and economic growth, and that if some policies come at the expense of growth, well, maybe we don't need to worry about it so much. What's half a percentage point in growth rates between friends, really? Really something to be worried about? We hear this every week in our opinion columns, on our current affairs programming. Growth isn't everything. We saw it in the Facebook feedback on our report urging a reconsideration of the merits of economic growth. We hear it too often also from many parts of the government, maybe not quite so bluntly, but in every major policy with spending or spending implications or that impose regulatory cost that's imposed without a reasonable cost-benefit assessment, that's kind of saying that economic growth doesn't matter and we don't need to care about it. Well, what's a percentage point of difference anyway? Think about going back to 1970. If real per capita GDP growth rates had been 1 percentage point higher in New Zealand over that period, we'd today have higher per capita GDP than Australia, and we'd be fourth in the OECD instead of below the median. A point can make a lot of difference when you take it over 45 years. And over that period, Australian economic growth only really outpaced New Zealand's by 1/3 of a point. But over 45 years, that matters. Or think about it another way. A 10% increase in real GDP per capita reduces the number of deaths in an earthquake by 5.3%, according to the best numbers I've found on it. Richer places can afford stronger buildings. Imagine that Wellington were to get its long-predicted earthquake in, say, 2034. So we've got another 20 years. Economic growth between now and then, under a 1% real growth rate, would reduce fatalities by 12%, and that's great. But 63% fewer people might die under a 4% growth rate. These things matter. We should celebrate the economic growth that we have had, and we should especially celebrate that over the longer term, the gains from that growth have done a lot, not just to help the richer cohorts, but also to help the poor. Incomes for the top 10% in New Zealand, on the best data that we've got on it, from 1953 onwards, for the top 10%, they increased by about 1.5 times. Good for the rich. The bottom 90% had their incomes double. Growth has been stronger for the poorest, not for the top 10%. Now, that doesn't mean that poverty doesn't still exist, but rather that it's a bit of a myth that economic growth only helps the rich. If we look over the longer time period, economic growth is the only thing that can really solve real poverty. And that's even before we'll start counting the access to the range of technology and improved medical services that are available to the poorest people in New Zealand today that the richest in 1953 couldn't imagine. We need to have a sense of what we're foregoing when politicians advocate policies that come at a strong cost to economic growth. So long as productivity continues to improve, economic growth can continue forever, even in a finite world. Economic growth doesn't depend on raw materials, it depends on our ingenuity in coming up with new ways of combining things. That's real productivity growth, and that's what matters. The last 40 years have pulled billions of people out of dire, abject poverty as economic growth really spread through East Asia and then India and China. The fraction of the world living in desperate, real, dollar-a-day level kind of poverty is much lower now than it ever was, thanks to economic growth. In the long run, the single best way of solving problems of poverty is growth. Now, some costly policies will still be worthwhile. As the country gets richer, we can afford to spend proportionately more on some of the nice things that we care about, like environmental quality. But we shouldn't engage in wishful thinking about things either. So I'm thinking here in particular about the OECD's recent report on inequality and economic growth. I think it fell into the wishful thinking camp. They were claiming that inequality is harmful for economic growth, and they were claiming that it ran through an education channel where lower tiers are less likely to get education, and that we needed to be boosting education to improve growth rates and addressing inequality. Now, I also agree that we should be doing more to help the education outcomes for poorer cohorts, but if you look into the OECD's analysis, their raw numbers had no effect of education on growth. They were saying education didn't matter, and when they wanted to make the case for education, they had to rely on other reports on the merits of economic growth, ones that said that inequality actually increases growth. So there's a bit of an inconsistency in there, and a lot of their stats had some issues. As the global economy changes and the tyranny of economic distance seems to be worsening rather than improving, agglomeration matters, it's even more important that New Zealand stop its complacence about economic growth and productivity growth. Many of our policies around how we make housing needlessly expensive, and that especially hurts the poor. How we punish foreigners who want to bring their capital and their expertise here to invest and give jobs for people here. And how we manage to set environmental regimes around resource extraction that somehow manage to both stop development and provide worse environmental outcomes than alternatives. We need to stop doing that. We need to reevaluate those kinds of things with strong consideration of their effects on economic growth. Growth is good, and when we choose policies that come at a cost to growth, well, if we're going to do it, we should do it with our eyes wide open and in full recognition of the cost that's going to impose in the future. Thanks. I'll turn it over now to Chris.
Thanks very much, Eric. Can I acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues and friends, David Clark, James Shaw, Oliver and Eric, and ladies and gentlemen. And we can also say thank you to the New Zealand Initiative for organising this event and to everyone for coming along. We need more organisations like the New Zealand Initiative in public life, and we need more events like this talking about important issues like economic growth. Look, I only have about 10 minutes, so I want to, in this short speech, argue forcefully for you that economic growth is a good thing, has demonstrably made us better off and continues to do so. I want to deal with 3 specific objections that are commonly raised about economic growth, and then I want to talk specifically about New Zealand. So to start with the first proposition, which is that economic growth is good, and I hope this will be largely uncontested by my panellists today, because even the modern day Green Party has come around to the view that economic growth is a good thing. Back in 1972, the Values Party, which is the precursor to the Green Party, of course, their manifesto talked earnestly about trying to achieve zero population growth so that we would have zero economic growth. And Rod Donald used to talk about negatively about the world's fixation with economic growth, and even as near ago as 2010, when Jeanette Fitzsimons retired from Parliament, she said we need to systematically examine the proposition that growth actually makes us better off. So I think James is made of sterner stuff than that, so I hope he doesn't agree with any of that, because I think even the Greens these days accept that growth is good. And the case for economic growth is put out in the New Zealand Initiative publication. I think it makes the case pretty well. Look, for me, the basic point is that economic growth gives us choices. So for thousands and probably millions of years, the lives of people in the world was nasty, brutish and short. The Industrial Revolution changed all that along with modern capitalism. Economic growth has made us wealthier and healthier. As we've got richer, child mortality has dropped and we're living longer, we can spend more on healthcare, we can invest more in education. And I really like this quote about growth by the famous economist Julian Simon. It's hard for us to imagine, for example, that in 1900, less than 1 in 5 homes had running water, flush toilets, a vacuum cleaner, gas or electric heat. In 1950, fewer than 20% of homes had air conditioning or a dishwasher or a microwave oven. Today, between 80 and 100% of American homes have all those modern conveniences. Those things were given to us by economic growth. By almost any objective measure, 2014 was the safest, healthiest, happiest year in human history. Child mortality has fallen by half since 1990. It's the same with maternal mortality. Global life expectancy is 70 years and climbing. Economic growth has dragged billions of people out of poverty. In September 2000, some of you will remember the heads of 147 countries coming together for the Millennium Development Goals. And all those heads of state pledged that we would halve the proportion of people on earth living in direst poverty or extreme poverty by 2015. And most people said that's impossible. They scoffed at it. How will you do that? Well, we smashed that target. We did it in 2010. In just 10 years, we halved the number of people living in extreme poverty. China itself lifted 680 million people. The numbers are scarcely believable. 680 million people alone out of poverty, which is more than the entire population of Latin America. Chinese per capita real income has risen by a factor of 20. That's not 20%, a factor of 20. That's almost 2,000% in just 20 years. That is economic growth, and that matters. So let's deal with some of the objections to economic growth. So the first is the claim that economic growth is necessarily limited because we'll run out of natural resources. And this has been at the heart of objections to growth since Malthus in 1798. Malthus thought an ever-increasing population would overwhelm the world's capacity to use scarce agricultural land to provide food, and famine and war would result. He was completely wrong. While resources may be scarce, and this is the key point, human ingenuity is limitless. Agricultural production, driven by innovation and technology, has grown exponentially faster than population growth. Market economies find ever more efficient ways to harvest existing resources, or they find substitutes. And in the 1970s, everyone started worrying about global food supply again. Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb, and it starts by saying this: the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, in spite of any programs we embark upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. He was utterly and spectacularly wrong. And hilariously, he still claims he's correct. And he was saying as late as last year that we need to get ready for a situation in which we eat ourselves and we eat the dead in order to give us sustenance because of the oncoming population disaster. It's hard to know why anyone takes this clown seriously. Neo-Malthusianism manifests itself these days in the wild claims made about peak oil and other resources. Peak oil was first raised in 1909. People reckon there was 25 years left of oil. Global oil production today is about 100 million barrels per day, and reserves have never been higher. And of course, oil is a finite resource, as are all non-renewable resources. And as these resources get more scarce, the price will rise. The pricing mechanism encourages people to be more efficient and look for alternatives. That's essentially why we had shale gas being investigated in the first place. The second objection is about the environment. Let's talk about that. And I made the point earlier that economic growth gives us choices. One of those choices is to care about the environment. The evidence shows that economic growth tends to improve environmental quality. Growth brings improvements in technology. Consumer demand grows for cleaner and greener products. The environmental records of the poorest nations in the world are generally shocking. And the reason for that is that they rightly, some would argue, prioritise economic development and the alleviation of poverty and hunger over the environment. And economists have even figured out a GDP per capita level where the trade-off starts to go the other way, where the environment starts to matter more, about $10,000 per capita. People were generally astonished last year when China struck a historic deal with the United States to combat climate change, but it's utterly consistent with the model I've just laid out. And often the best way of dealing with environmental problems is through the market mechanism. New Zealand's been a world leader here with fishing quotas, for example. Absent a system of enforceable property rights in fish, the tragedy of the commons would result, and our stocks would highly likely to be exhausted. So let me talk also about poverty and inequality, because this is the third objection commonly made to economic growth. The first point to make here is that global inequality between countries is declining. The inequality between countries is declining. That, of course, is a function of lifting billions of people out of poverty. The second point I would make is we have to be careful not to conflate the two, as people often do. They talk generically and generally about poverty and inequality. But the key point is poverty. Poverty is the most important thing to focus on. And as we've already heard from Eric, economic growth does lift people out of poverty. And Eric's given you the numbers, and so have I. And the third point is the point I've already made, is that growth gives us choices. The ability to lift the most vulnerable people out of poverty, to provide for them, the ability to have a highly redistributive welfare state. And as one commentator has noted in the past, you can't have social justice without economic growth. Economic growth gives us the ability to redistribute our resources to those who need it most, to the poor, to the sick, to the indigent, to those who can't care for themselves. But you've got to have a growing economy to do that in the first place. We have a highly redistributive welfare system in New Zealand, and that creates social justice. So in closing, let me make a few remarks about our current economic prospects and how they relate to economic growth. The history of economic growth in New Zealand is not a great one. In 1950, we were one of the richest countries in the world, and from 1950 onwards, we squandered that position. Per capita income grew just 1.4% per year from 1950 to 1985, when the OECD average was 2.87%. Between 1973 and 1985, a series of utterly disastrous policies saw growth stagnate, inflation skyrocket, and imbalances build up in the New Zealand economy that required painful correction after 1984. Those reforms were tough but necessary. They brought New Zealand into the modern world, and it's my belief that our economic reformers of that time don't get enough credit. In Australia, people like Paul Keating and Bob Hawke are economic heroes, and they receive standing ovations at Labour Party conferences. I don't think the same would be true of Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble and people like that at Labour Party conferences today. Our economic growth since 1984 has been pretty lumpy. In 2005, after 6 okay years as Finance Minister, Michael Cullen unleashed a fusillade of spending. It jumped just 50% in 5 years. Most of it was wasteful. The Salvation Army in 2008 commented that there'd been little evidence of social progress despite the increased expenditure. By the time we came to office in 2008, the economy had been in recession for a year. The tradable sector of the economy had been in recession for over 5 years. We have spent the last 5 years unpicking the economic disaster left to us by the Labour Party. So where are we now? Well, our growth rate is one of the fastest in the OECD. It looks like we'll grow at or about 3% for a while, as we're growing at the moment. That's well above the historic average of 2%. And to pick up on the point that Eric made before, that 1% does matter. It sounds small, but over time, it's huge. But as the Prime Minister is so fond of saying, we don't just need 1 or 2 years of good economic growth. If we want to close that income gap with Australia, and if we want to climb up that OECD ladder, but more importantly, not just about numbers, more importantly, it's about providing for people in our country, we need sustained economic growth year after year. So we've got to go for growth. We've got to rationally analyse policies properly to ask, will they make the boat go faster or just redistribute existing resources? We need ongoing sustained microeconomic reform. We've got to get government spending down as a percentage of GDP. This government, despite the fiscal disaster that we inherited from Labor, has got core crown expenditure as a percentage of GDP down to 30.5%, and it's projected to fall further. But actually, that just returns the situation to what it was in 2004 and 5, before Michael Cullen went on his massive spending binge. So people think we've gone through austerity. I mean, all we are doing is returning core Crown expenditure as a percentage of GDP back to where we were in 2004 and 5. That actually matters. There's lots of studies that show that as a percentage of GDP, the amount of the size of government, the size of the state matters, and the answer is the smaller the better. We need to reform our planning laws as well. And RMA reform is crucially important, and incidentally, that will actually help inequality in New Zealand because as our housing costs have gone up, they eat up more and more portion of people's income, particularly the poor. So those things are really important. As a government, we've laid out a pretty comprehensive reform agenda. It's really important. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me just say that I think we are on the cusp of something special as a country. We have tackled the global financial crisis. We are rebuilding Christchurch. We are starting to tackle the intractable social problems that have bedeviled New Zealand for far too long, like intergenerational welfare dependency and like housing affordability. And I believe that under our government and under John Key's leadership, we are set up for years of sustained economic growth, but we can't be complacent. We need sustained economic reform so that we grow at 3%, or better yet, 4% and 5%. And with that, that will create a better lives for all New Zealanders. Thank you.
I want to acknowledge, obviously, the New Zealand initiative for putting this on, and the authors of the paper, which was provocative and interesting, although I suspect, as Chris said, we're not going to disagree on as much as people might like. I might disagree with some of the characterising that Chris has done, the 6 rather average economic years at the start of the Labour government. I know that success has many fathers, and I've often claimed credit for the 25% the economy grew in real terms under the last government, even though I wrote lots of papers at Treasury that Michael Cullen clearly didn't pay much attention to, and that I also worked in a minister's office for 5 minutes. I still claimed much credit and paternity for the success. As a sometimes student of history, I was intrigued that the paper we were given as background labelled economic growth essentially the father of Western society's success. That was what the paternity test revealed in the paper. And the widespread and further spreading Western Judeo-Christian value set didn't get a look in. The elevation of personal freedoms and individual rights secured no credit whatsoever, nor did the relentless pursuit of progress or some ideal future state that underpins Western religious history and philosophical thought, and neither did the curiosity or the science that Judeo-Christian societies gave birth to. So I want to say at the outset, unlike the view presented in the paper or we're debating, I think there is a case to be made to say that the chicken did come before the egg. That said, the late arrival of the dismal science is to be welcomed. And I say that, of course, advisedly, acknowledging that the main job of a politician is to make both weather forecasters and economists look good. But in order for economics to take all of the credit for the success, we have to assume away a lot of other evidence. And I think even looking around the room here at the esteemed economists, few would be brave enough to assume all of that away. As I said at the outset, I think we're going to agree on a great deal. Economic growth is the stuff of motherhood and apple pie. Points of debate, I think, will be more around the recipe for the pie, what flavour we're after, how to best cook the pie, how long the pie will last, and how best we divide it up to ensure future prosperity. Let me torture the metaphor just a little further. James, I think, will tell you that the pie won't cook if you don't look after the oven. And I have to say that I think Chris has already delivered a few political one-liners and some half-baked ideas. Well, I am going to be very interested in the feedback afterwards and the conversations that follow. Labour, as you will know, is in a much advertised listening phase. The last 2 elections, we've said that we're willing to take some big policy calls to address what we regard as economic imbalances, and that, the pro-growth tax reform, R&D tax credits, and of course the capital gains tax, KiwiSaver extensions, monetary policy reform. And in Yes Minister terms, these are indeed kind of courageous policies that we took to the electorate, and they have been rewarded commensurately. The capital gains tax the Reserve Bank has started calling for does sound very familiar to us, but we are taking time out to consider its merits at the moment. If you accept economic growth is a good thing, and I think there is a burden of proof on those who don't, we will agree on much of what's required in a democracy to ensure it continues. We want enforceable property rights, strong rule of law, well-regulated markets. We might disagree on what that means, but we will want them. Demonstrable social mobility, a high trust society, and a good education system for starters. And I want to use what remains of my 10 minutes, though, to introduce a couple of higher-level issues. Amidst the minutiae of debates about how to make the boat go faster, if you like, the pie grow bigger, are some bigger picture issues that I think we don't want to lose sight of. And the first, for me, is the maturation of existing technologies. Technologies coming on stream today are displacing human mental labour. And we have, as a society, some questions to address. Because productivity gains, I think, should be embraced. And there is no doubt that lots of the technologies that are coming on stream are more efficient and effective, cost-effective, and will deliver better results for society than human labour. Under current settings, that means that replacing mental labour with computing power will leave fewer productive opportunities in the economy unless we're able to retrain all of our workforce to be the people driving those technologies. Let me give you 3 examples of where it's happening already. So in law firms, there's a thing called discovery. Some of you may have undertaken it in your youths. This is now, of course, done mainly by computers. Emails can be searched hundreds, thousands an hour, much more effectively by computers than people. They don't get bored, they don't go to sleep while they're reading, they don't miss things, they're more cost effective, and so the accuracy factor is well worth, aside from the price, taking on. Surgery. In Dunedin, I'm aware of surgeons who are jumping up and down with excitement about the fact they don't have to see patients as much as they used to. They do all their pre-screening with computers. It's more accurate. They have to spend less time with pesky questions and frustrations, and they can just get on with getting their fingers into the bodies and moving things around. So that technology is there. It's displacing the professions. My brother works for a company called Compaq. I'm sure many of you here will be familiar with it. He calls himself, somewhat euphemistically, a fruit sorter. But his job, he's in artificial intelligence. He's a software engineer. And his job basically is to put IT technicians out of work. Not just the manual labour people who used to be on the lines sorting the fruit, but the people who used to run the machines that replaced them. It's about teaching computers to teach themselves so that they can be smarter and more cost effective in their duties than the people that used to maintain them. So the IT industry is also under threat. And of course, if I learnt one thing at Treasury, it is that incentives matter. It was repeated to me on many occasions, incentives matter. And the incentives are greater, of course, on employers to replace the expensive jobs, the high-wage jobs in the workforce. So the professions are the ones that are under threat. Doesn't mean that there's lots of manual jobs that aren't still under threat. The biggest employer, I think, in the Western world is the transport industry. Point A to point B, logistics, be it the taxi, be it the pit mine trucks, or supply chain transport. That is all, of course, under threat with driverless technologies in cars. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be better than us. It doesn't, make sure that driverless technology doesn't text while driving, doesn't take pee to drive through the night, doesn't need expensive rest breaks, etc. And the economics takes us there because, of course, insurance companies are going to charge lower premiums for vehicles that don't crash as often. And those are going to be the ones as that technology matures, that are not human and are not subject to human error. Won't happen overnight, of course, but these technologies will come on stream. There's a YouTube video which has prompted much of my thought on this over recent months and anxiety about it, because I don't think there's enough going on in this area of politicians thinking about the consequences of this change that we're facing. It's called Humans Need Not Apply. If you haven't seen it, do have a look. And the point they make at the end of this, their short presentation, none of it's new, it's just well presented, is that 45% of the jobs in the American workforce are subject to threat from new technologies that already exist. They may not have matured, but the technologies already exist. In the Great Depression, 25% unemployment. You don't have to employ all of these technologies to have a socially disruptive experience. So productivity improvements are on the way. We should embrace them, in my view, and score as many of the programming jobs as we can at the top. But there is a redistributive problem presented, because we still want to live in the kind of society, I think, where we present opportunities to each new generation, where we make sure that the poor, the children in lower socioeconomic circumstances have enough to eat, have good educational opportunities, and that we preserve opportunities for social mobility, essentially. In social mobility, I think there's good evidence around the fact that social mobility is generally better. There's a strong correlation with more equal societies. This is not an easy problem to solve, of course. If it was, somebody would have solved it already. And we need a society with trust. I mean, economic growth tends to be better in societies where there's high levels of trust, and that often equates to a good understanding of the rules, a more homogenous population, be that in a shared cosmopolitanism or some other kind of homogeneity. And how do we create that? Maybe it's through a longer compulsory education system. It's interesting to note that causative effects of education, as Oliver brought up, are difficult to prove, but they correlate strongly with economic growth. And I've got a personal, and this is highly speculative, I have no evidence whatsoever, I'll put that up front, opinion that may well be to do with the fact that people, if they're in a school for a long time together, get to the same set of values in that education system, therefore share a common identity and a common sense of where the society is heading, and are willing to work towards the same goals, don't feel like there's other groups in society that are getting around the rules, cheating, not part of who they are and their identity and where they're going, and therefore are more likely to voluntarily comply with the tax system, get on with their lives rather than worrying about what other people are doing. Personal theory. The final point, because I suspect I'm getting close to my time, is that the bigger picture thing is around inequalities, and again, Oliver raised the issue of the OECD evidence, and there is a hot debate around that. I'm going to acknowledge that up front. But the OECD suggested that if New Zealand had been a more equal society in recent decades, we would have had 15.5% more growth. I think that's a pretty stunning statistic. It warrants some good debate because that's what they think, and they are not lightweights, I think we'll agree. And there are a number of logical reasons. Again, the logic sits there and says that more equal societies, of course, have a number of reasons why people might participate in them, might be more constructive in them. I'm going to lay out what I think. First off, abject poverty isn't good for anybody. Hungry children don't learn well. Now, I don't hear anyone over here arguing for abject poverty. Let me say that. I'm not going to put that straw man up. But where kids don't have what other kids have, where they live in cold, damp homes, and we've got plenty of them in New Zealand, they get sick. Where they do miss out on opportunities, they aren't included in sporting development and extra educational opportunities and so on, they're more likely to grow up thinking society's against them. And it probably is. And they are more likely, statistics tell us, to end up in the justice system and be a drag on society rather than contributing to economic growth. So that's one reason more equal societies probably are more productive. Second, often investment of talent is decided by our own personal circumstances. So people who grow up in poor socioeconomic conditions often are all about making sure they maximise their wealth over any other objective because they want to look after the people around them. They've experienced what poverty is like. They don't want other people to experience that. Rather than concentrating on what their best social contribution might be, how they create a better society, what their contribution might be. Now, there's a number of judgment calls about what a good social contribution is, and that's a point of debate. Third and penultimate point about why I think more equal societies are more productive and promote higher economic growth is that investment in common infrastructure tends to happen more readily and quickly in more equal societies. So that's investment in hospitals, schools and roads, most bluntly. In my maiden speech in 2011, I was thinking back, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was something along the lines of, in China, the high-speed rail there was already 8 times as long, the railway lines, as it was in the USA, and going ahead at 12 times the speed. That's about a vision for an accessible economy that everybody participates in, and the growth in China obviously has been impressive. So there's a reason for common infrastructure that supports the needs that everybody has that we can't afford individually. That's our hospitals and schools as well. And the final point about why I think more equal societies grow the economy faster is that in a fair society, everyone's willing to put their shoulders to the wheel. And it's the point I alluded to earlier. Voluntary tax compliance is a good thing, but people will try and avoid paying their fair share if they think everyone else is. If they think some group has a special deal cut out, or they're not pulling their weight, or whatever, you have people who do not pull together to create a better society and a more productive society. People start to go to more selfish motives, and I don't think people are entirely selfish. That's my point of view. We'll debate how best to get there, and we already are, but I don't think that any of us will disagree that greater prosperity holds the potential for a better society. Thanks very much.
So to the west of the city of Baotou in Mongolia and China, you can see a large oval artificial lake. This is the Baotou Steel Group's tailings pond, and it contains 180 million tonnes of fine waste powder left over from iron ore processing, from ore processing. The lake is a black, barely liquid, toxic sludge that clocks up roughly 3 times the background radiation, and the background radiation is already pretty high. It is 11 square kilometres in size, and it's one of the largest tailings ponds in China, but still only one of many. Baotou produces cerium, which is used in everything from colouring glass to making catalytic converters. It also makes cerium oxide, which is used to polish touchscreens on smartphones like mine and tablets. Baotou also produces neodymium. Now, neodymium is used to make lasers, which is pretty cool, as well as the magnets that are used in in-ear microphones, cell phone microphones, headphones, and computer hard drives. Awkwardly, neodymium batteries are also used in electric car motors and wind turbines, demonstrating that the West's shiny new high-tech, low-carbon, knowledge-based, smart green economy is kind of anything but. Can I just ask, so how many of you have read the report that we're discussing tonight yet? I recognise everyone's time poor here, so you may not have had a chance. Okay, great. Thank you. So for those of you that haven't, do have a read, although I recommend having some moisturiser to one side because it's pretty dry. I'm fascinated, actually, that anyone felt the need to defend the notion of economic growth because it is the dominant ideology of our times. And I recognise that the New Zealand Initiative is based in Wellington Central, where last year 30% did vote for the Green Party, so I can understand that you may feel under siege by the chattering classes, as you put it. But there's always Epsom. So I know that I've been asked to come here to provide perhaps a critique or a contrary view to the report. Some of you might be expecting me to reinforce the stereotype of the anti-growth greenie. Some of you might be hoping that I will bust that stereotype wide open. I'm actually hoping to do neither of those things because there are a number of things that I agree with and there are a number of things that I disagree with. I'm not intending to do a line-by-line critique of the report nor launch a wholesale attack on the underlying assumptions. But I do want to offer a few things to think about. So first up, I'm going to say this out loud, I do not deny the material benefits that rising incomes have produced over the last few centuries. I am not opposed to growth in and of itself. As the report points out, as per capita incomes have increased, child mortality has declined and life expectancy in countries like New Zealand has increased. We are healthier, richer, smarter, well, at least better educated than our forebears. So technology that was once the preserve of the rich has become more accessible as what is called the so-called democratization of luxury. I mean, I have a supercomputer in my pocket, and that would have not been possible the year I was born. So those realities can't be denied. Rises in per capita income definitely have benefits to humans. But we can't assume that perpetual growth of this variety is always beneficial under all circumstances or even necessarily feasible. So the report makes 3 central claims. Number one, instead of ruining the environment, economic growth helps us to manage and preserve it. This is in the introduction to the report. 2, instead of making us unhappy, economic growth enables us to lead longer, healthier and more fulfilled lives. And 3, instead of depleting our resources, economic growth is helping us to find alternative ways of satisfying our needs. So let's start with the claim that instead of ruining the environment, economic growth helps us to manage and preserve it. The report calls upon the environmental Kuznets curve, which suggests that as economic growth rises, environmental outcomes first worsen and then improve. It also suggests that the curve for more recently developing countries is both shallower and shorter than it is for countries that did their developing earlier some time ago. In other words, things in developing countries will get worse, but not as bad as they did in, say, industrial Britain. And that the recovery will also take less time. The problem is that looking at it country by country, rather than looking at it in terms of the planet as a whole. So the West has largely recovered from the industrial era mess that we created, but it's done so largely by exporting its mess to other countries, hence the toxic lake in Batu in China. The Australian Labor MP, Andrew Lee, recently pointed out that the US economy weighs about as much or only marginally more than it did a century ago. So what does that mean? The dramatic increase in income and wealth that most Americans have experienced has not grown the mass of the economy. New technologies and more efficient resource use have left the physical footprint of the US economy largely static through most of the 20th century. I mean, that's an extraordinary idea. Think about that. So, just before you think about that, consider this. In the last 3 years, China has used more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. Now think about that. In other words, America made it through its post-Civil War recovery, World War I, World War II, the post-World War II boom, the space race, the Cold War, and it still used less cement than China did in the last 3 years. And you might argue, and it's pretty staggering, you might argue that that is simply the story of one nation's development, but it belies the interdependent nature of the global economy and the environment. So China's cement use boom has largely been because it's now selling the United States kind of everything, right? So you have to look at the mass of the global economy as a whole, not just one part of it, right? You can't just talk about the US economy in isolation. Now, I'm marginally over 40 years old, increasingly less marginally. In the time that I have been alive, the world's population has doubled, right? There are twice as many humans on the planet now as when I was born. That's been great for GDP, but it's not been great for the planet's non-human population. So whilst the number of humans has doubled, the number of wild animals on Earth has halved in the same period of time. The biggest declines in animal numbers have been in low-income developing nations, while conservation efforts in rich nations have seen small improvements overall, which suggests that the report may be right that increasing wealth leads to environmental outcomes. But the problem is that the big declines in wildlife in the rich nations happened a long time ago. The last wolf in the United Kingdom was shot dead in 1680. They're already dead. In the past 540 million years, there have been 5 major events in which over 50% of all animal species on Earth died. We're currently living through the 6th Great Extinction, which is happening at a rate roughly 1,000 times faster than the average pace in the Earth's history, making it the fastest extinction event on record. It's known as the Anthropocene defaunification. I know you can go a lot of places with that. But that's because it's been caused entirely by human activity, economic activity. So the report seems to argue that this is largely due to a lack of property rights. Quoting from the report, if somebody owned all the whales and could enforce property rights over them, whales have been harvested sustainably, with the price of whale oil, not that one, predictably increasing over time, end quote. Now, this may feel uncomfortable, but using the same logic, if someone had already owned all of the black people in Africa, slaves could have been harvested and shipped to the Americas more sustainably, with the price increasing over time. That might feel a little uncomfortable. I don't think that you can reduce everything to its utility value and then hope that more of the same produces different results. So the report calls upon Dr. Seuss's story, The Lorax. I'm going to call upon The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If we accept that in the notion, if we accept the notion that in the pursuit of economic growth you can't make an omelette without a little interspecies genocide, then we have no right to complain when the Vogons show up to destroy Earth to make way for an interstellar bypass. Putting ourselves in the shoes of the Vogons, yep, we're messy, but this is a necessary step in our economic development. Later on, when we're wealthier and more developed as a result of these interstellar bypasses, RONs, will have better environmental practices, and we won't need to destroy more planets in order to achieve our goals. That's a little late for us humans on the asteroid belt formerly known as Earth. So just as our enlightened practices in the future are no use to the species that we've already wiped off the face of the planet. So I'm coming on a little strong. But I had a version of the speech which was more kind of moderate, and I thought, well, you're here for entertainment. So I'm coming on really heavy, because that's fun. The Greens talk about, or we are starting to talk about more about, something called the steady state economy, the idea, the notion that you can have an economy in which there is a steady state of material and energy throughput through the economy. And it's interesting to me that in the last couple of years, energy use has decoupled from economic growth. And last year, encouragingly, there seemed to be a small decoupling between carbon emissions, the growth in carbon emissions, and economic growth. These are good signs. This is good news. And that's globally, right? That's not just in any one country, that's globally. So it does seem that it may be possible to get to a situation where you can have economic growth and our running up or running past environmental, planetary limits isn't necessarily totally tied to that thing. So I'm a fan of exploring that more. And I know that in order to transition to the kind of sustainable green economy that, frankly, we all want, some things are going to have to grow. We're going to need more renewable energy and less non-renewable energy, right? We're going to need, better systems of manufacturing than the ones that we've got now. And I'm really encouraged to hear a lot of what David's talking about in terms of roboticization and artificial intelligence and what's going to occur next, which is going to mess up everything, especially in China, distributed manufacturing using 3D printing and those kinds of things. That is going to completely disrupt the economic model that we've got, and I imagine lead to another era of quite extraordinary GDP growth. So I'll just finish with a few other kind of fairly random thoughts. I was going to talk about pie, actually, but David has stolen most of that joke from me. I was going to say that, National talks about wanting to grow the pie and Labor talks about wanting to divide the pie, and that the Greens have a tendency to say, well, the size of the pie is kind of limited by the size of the oven that you're cooking it in, and that while you're making pie, you should keep it clean, otherwise everyone will get food poisoning. But I'll finish with a couple of things. I haven't talked about, alternative measures for GDP or anything like that, but there was a piece about happiness in the report, so I thought that I'd quote from one of my favourite economists, David Lee Roth, who said, "Money can't buy you happiness, but it can buy you a nice big yacht to pull up alongside happiness." And what the report seems to hint at is another one. I can't remember who said this, I'm sorry, but it kind of, as I was kind of reading through it, that, especially around the stuff around the environmental Kuznets curve, one of my favourite sayings, which is, if stupidity got us into this mess, well, why can't it get us out of it? Thanks.
We now have time for your questions, but I would like to actually ask the first question to Eric, whether you've got anything to respond to what you've just heard, specifically to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is Eric's favorite book.
The hitchhiker's analogy started when Prosser, who was a council planner, went up to tear down Arthur Dent's house without respecting his property rights after having posted notification in a downstairs office that had a "Beware of the Leopard" sign on the door. They were there drawing an analogy between council planners who will go and use process for government taking property without proper compensation, and drawing an analogy there to what the Vogons might do to us if they were similar kinds of planners rather than, rapacious capitalists, which is the analogy that is trying to be drawn. But I did enjoy hearing about the Hitchhiker's Guide. I'd note that on exporting pollution, Gene Grossman found that NAFTA manifestly failed to do that, that we had instead improving environmental quality when it became possible for American firms to set up there, exporting jobs to Mexico while also increasing jobs in the U.S. and improving environmental quality in Mexico at the same time. It's not necessary that it'll always turn out that way, but it seemed to in that case that was studied. I agree with David that I didn't hit on culture and religion, except to the extent that I noted that we were very lucky in New Zealand to have been colonized by the British rather than by the French or the Dutch, either of which could have been disastrous. I agree also that there's some nice, interesting issues that will come up with maturing of existing tech, and a lot of it's going to depend on the speed of transition. We saw over the 20th century just a massive decline in the number of Americans that are employed in agriculture, and same in New Zealand. But we don't have hordes of unemployed ex-farmers and grandchildren of ex-farmers sitting around in the States doing nothing. They are employed doing other useful things for people, and the same thing will happen with the next technology transition as well, so long as it doesn't happen in like a 30-day period or something.
Rob Hosking, I've got all sorts of affiliations, but basically I'm a journalist, which means I'm going to ask a very simplistic question. I'm going to start with an observation and then base a question on it. The observation is, it seemed to me that I'll pick up on a phrase that Chris used about economic growth giving us choices, and it seemed to me that the speakers on that side were talking a lot about that, whereas you guys were talking a lot more about the nature of what those choices might be. So my very simplistic question is, given all the issues that have been raised tonight, and there's some fascinating sort of neurons going off in my brain here, the most important choice you think New Zealand needs to make over the next 30 years, one, and why? So each of the speakers there.
I actually think it has something to do with what David was talking about. So I think that we are about to go into a period of economic disruption, the like of which we have not seen before. It'll be bigger than the 1980s, 1990s, and I think it'll be as significant as the agriculture to industrial revolution. And we are not thinking about that yet. And it is, we are kind of focused on short-term needs, and this is a trend that is only edging in around the economy, sort of 1-2% of the economy, so it's kind of hard to see, and it's hard to see what the impacts will be. But I think that we need to devote significant resource to thinking about what a kind of post-employment economy looks like when all of your needs, all your material needs are met by machines.
David?
Yeah, of course I'm going to focus on that. That was one of my key points. I guess it invites a response to what Eric has said about, those unemployed agricultural workers who aren't sitting around scratching their heads what to do. The challenge, I think, with this transition is that there was another path at that stage. It was to re-educate, use the new technologies and so on. The prospect we have, I think, facing us, and maybe I'm not quite as strong as James about how disruptive that will be, but I think we need to think about the transition, is what should we be doing with ourselves, and how should we be shaping our society if human labour becomes uneconomic in all of its forms?
Chris, what's your big idea?
Yeah, I guess just in response to what's been said, I'm a little more sanguine about the technological disruption happening. I mean, 2 points. One, I mean, that's been happening since the Industrial Revolution, technological progress, and we cope. In fact, we embrace it. Not just cope, we embrace it. It makes our lives better. The second thing is we'll get it wrong. If we try and forecast what will happen, we will just get it wrong because the history of human progress is that we get forecasts hopelessly wrong. So yeah, we need to think about it, but do we need to sort of get too worried about it? I don't think so. You know, what will be, will be. But in terms of the biggest challenge facing New Zealand over the next 30 years, I actually think it's about, it's a current challenge, and it's one that's going to get worse unless we do something about it, and that's housing affordability. And if you look at Auckland house prices are out of control, and the simple reason for that is a lack of supply, and we're not building enough houses. And the simple reason for that is that we've placed artificial constraints on building houses. You know, New Zealand is the size of the United Kingdom. It does not have to be like this, you know. It does not have to be this way where young Kiwis spend ever-increasing amounts of their income and their salary trying to put a deposit together to buy a house, a modest house in Auckland. It doesn't have to be like that. There is another way. And unless we do something about it now, it is only going to get way worse. And that'll be a huge challenge for New Zealand over the next 30 years because it connects into all the things about inequality as well, and social mobility as well, and social progress.
Short to medium term, I'll agree with Chris. Getting land use policy right is probably critically important. It is what is exacerbating all of the inequality talk, as best I understand things. If you look at measures of after housing cost inequality versus before housing cost, it's worse. And a lot of the gains that have been coming to incomes at the bottom tier have been being eaten up in housing costs. In the longer term, if some of the issues come around on transition to a post-work society, then we could start looking at things like wealth taxes and redistribution and guaranteed annual incomes, but that is not something that you need to put in place in advance of that kind of technological shift. It's something you can do once it's happened, right? It's not, if you put that in 20 years ahead of it, hoping that you'll be then ready for it, you might prevent the whole thing from emerging in the first place unnecessarily. There are some things that are better to hold your options open. In terms of one big policy push, just paying attention to cost effectiveness, regardless of what folks want to hope would work. There's so much stupid that could get ruled out if, regardless of what your values are, you just look at what's the policy meant to achieve, is it doing that, can we scrap it if it's not? Going back to zero-based budgeting on a lot of stuff would be really nice. In the absence of that, having an agency looking ex post at, well, are existing programs meeting standard, and if not, scrap them.
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. Like, I would have really liked to have seen someone from the Māori Party up there maybe coming in and having a debate too, because coming from a rural community, I wanted to hear discussions more around the rural side as opposed to the whole of the economy and that. And so when we're in rural communities, we are very different to urban. And a lot of the talk that you spoke of today, I didn't identify a lot in terms of what solutions we have in our communities. So social justice, I really like that talk that you had about there, that was part of the economic growth in that. But I mean, when we have a lot of social injustices in our rural communities, where does that platform sit? Talking of technology, you mentioned also too about how technology is taking over that human labour force, and as an example, AFCO Whitehall, which is now Tallies. Tallies have now implemented that into their own work strategies, so they are taking off platforms and implementing computers to do work. So how can we sustain in these communities when there's such a big pull around the country about these little townships that are going to be becoming ghost towns? So I didn't really hear a lot of kōrero in that about that, and I want to know what are you going to do about question
that? To answer?
Oh, actually, for the whole three panel, I mean, there was no specific solutions in terms of rural development and
let
growth.
me put Chris on the spot.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I've had the privilege of getting to know Marama Fox from the Māori Party a little bit over the last 6 months since I've been an MP, and she'd be a really good person to get for one of these sessions. She's got some pretty interesting views, pretty robust person. Yeah, look, it's a tricky and challenging one, but I guess you just got to go back to first principles and you say, yeah, there's some challenging times in rural communities around the world, but in New Zealand. I've spent some time up in Northland during the by-election, spent some time at AFCO Mariwa, which is, I suspect, a similar profile to Wairoa, where you were talking about. And I think the critical point is that economic growth and a growing economy gives the government the ability to provide support for workers who are in transition out of jobs. And we've got to make sure we do that there's a safety net for those who lose their jobs through technology, but also that there's a strong education system there to make sure that people can retrain, that we never neglect the concept of lifelong learning, that people can retrain and go to a polytech or go back to university to move into new jobs. And if that doesn't happen, the support is there from the government, and I believe that's a critical role of the government. To the wider point about rural communities, I think there is a role for government there in terms of making sure that they're connected to infrastructure. Things like ultra-fast broadband, which the government's rolling out, is really important, and policies like that.
Great, thanks. David.
Kia ora. I think the OECD has some interesting thoughts on this, and they have shifted away from talking so much about agglomeration effects and clustering and so on to talking about how for many developed countries now the most cost-effective route to raising GDP is through raising skills in the regions. It costs a lot less to lift people off the lowest skill levels up 1 or 2 tiers to be more productive people in society than it does to put another professor in a big city in a house that costs $1.5 million. And if 60% of your people are still in the regions, that productivity gain is multiplied further than if you focus on your cities and the agglomeration benefits there. So that's the OECD's thinking seems to have shifted on this over time. I think we're not doing enough for our regions, and that's in terms of economic development, that's where the big gains are, and I think that we need to be deliberate about it. And I agree with Chris that the educational aspect of it is incredibly important, making sure that there are opportunities to retrain, and often it's a partner who's tied to a job in a community. A husband or wife tied to a job in a community that's well paying, their partner cannot travel far away to re-educate. It needs to be that those educational opportunities are there, although digital technologies again present other opportunities for retraining. So there's some very careful thinking that has to go on, and I think some very deliberate thinking, and I think that's not yet it hasn't matured, that thinking, to the extent, because we're seeing high unemployment and growing unemployment in the regions, and a dissatisfaction as median wages get further and further behind the bigger cities.
James?
Yeah, so 3 things. I'll focus on the economic development in the regions. So I think that there's a lot of promise in the laying down of the UFB network. And of course, just having cable doesn't necessarily automatically lead to, it's not the only condition that you need, but it's a necessary condition. So I'm delighted to see cables getting laid down in some incredibly remote parts of the country. I was up in it's sort of north of Aporiki, going up the coast there, and they were there was a chorus van laying down underground cable. Now there's a population of only about 3,000 people up there, and the electricity up there is pretty patchy. Like every time a cow rubs itself up against a pole, the whole coast gets a brownout. But you're starting to see the kind of infrastructure for a whole new economy there, and if you can support it with education, and primarily education, then you're going to see some uplift. 2 is ecosystem services. So I think that we poorly price or don't price the value that we receive from the ecosystem that we use to run our economy, and what that would, if we did, that you would start to see a transfer into some of the regions based on maintaining and enhancing that. And 3, and I know that the New Zealand Initiative is planning a report about this, but I don't think that the regions often share particularly well in the wealth that is actually generated in the regions. So I'll give you an example. A wind farm essentially is an extractive resource. You get a big company based in Wellington or Auckland that comes into the region, it sits in a wind farm, it creates a few jobs temporarily in construction, it pays the local farmers upon whose land it is sited, and there's a little bit of a charity fund, and then it exports energy and dividends to Auckland and Wellington or wherever the company's based. Actually, what if the local area was to own that wind farm and get the majority of the benefit from that? So things like that, I think that we want to explore further, the idea of distributed ownership.
I just wonder whether the speakers from the Labour and Green parties would accept or reject Chris's proposition that a lower government expenditure to GDP ratio would stimulate economic growth?
I mean, I don't think government needs to be any bigger than it has to be. There's some interesting stuff that Danny Roderick's written that I'm sure others here will have read, suggesting that the size of government is correlated inversely to the trade not inversely to the trade exposure. So big countries that have large domestic markets that can absorb commodities when there's an international disruption don't need big governments. Likewise, economies that are a long way from markets and don't do a lot of trade don't need big governments. But those countries that seem to have big governments, bigger governments and be prosperous are ones that have a high exposure to international trade, and those are big export nations but they're small countries, so they can't absorb in domestic market shocks, are things like the Netherlands and Sweden. New Zealand, as it happens, is not a growing exporter as a proportion of GDP. In fact, it's been going backwards rapidly under the current government, which is a real shame, the fact that our exports to GDP ratio is dropping and is projected to drop further in coming years. But it would tend to suggest that most export losses can be, or more export losses can be absorbed, and so we don't need a bigger government in that instance.
You give us your ideal government size figure.
Well, following on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I'd have to say it was 42. I think, so from what I've seen about this, there are countries that are wealthier than us that have larger governments as a proportion, and there are countries that are wealthier than us that have smaller governments as a proportion of their thing, and the reverse is also true. There are countries that are less wealthy that have larger and also smaller. So there doesn't seem to be a necessarily huge correlation. I think it's probably overly simplistic to say that there is, for every single country in the world, a magic number at which, economic growth is kind of unconstrained, but all the basics are provided for. I think, as David was suggesting, that you probably need to look at the circumstances of different countries before coming up with your number for that country.
Rose.
Rose Patterson from the New Zealand Initiative, a research fellow working on education, so I have a specific education question. You all talked about the importance of it. And I'm quite interested in all of your views on school zoning. So we know that people who can afford to live in good school zones, wealthier people, have more choice for where they send their children to school, whereas low socioeconomic people, Māori and Pacific communities actually have less choice. So it's choice for the rich and not for the poor, and to me that seems pretty unfair, and I guess I'm just interested in all of your views on that.
Well, there's a lot to say about schooling, obviously, and you'll know a lot more than I will. There's a few things I'd say. One is that the countries that do the best have a number of features in common, and one seems to be that they have a really high expectation of the education level of their teachers. And Finland is always held up as the leading light. They have to have a master's degree. A friend of mine was briefly the Secretary for Education in Finland, and she's just moved on to do something else. She says that they intend to get towards master's level qualification for preschool teachers. In Finland, it is harder to get into the College of Education equivalent than it is to get into medicine or law. And the most prestigious profession to marry a partner in is education. That tells you a different kind of picture. Education is held up, ongoing professional development is important. Wages are not particularly high. It's not all about that kind of incentive. People don't go into teaching for the high wages, I don't believe. They go into teaching for other reasons, but they're well looked after, and it's held in high esteem. So some of those preconditions are important. School zoning, I think that there'd be a really interesting experiment, again, another personal theory, but it'd be interesting to see what would happen if all students who went to decile 1 to 3 schools were given a full university scholarship if they made it through the school. It would be a really interesting social experiment because there would be an incentive for people to join the lower decile schools who had from wealthier backgrounds. It would be a really interesting social mix. James Heckman's stuff on the value of ensuring that people from lower socioeconomic groups get to university is incredibly important in my mind. And his basic view is that the debt adversity of lower socioeconomic groups can be countered by giving scholarships. Not only is it a bonus to those people from lower socioeconomic groups, but it also adds to the GDP of the country, so there's a macro benefit. I buy into all of those ideas. On the specific zoning question you've asked, I'm going to let others have a crack at it.
We've talked about economic growth in pretty instrumental terms, if it's done for some purpose, and also talked rather in a way that assumes that if the government pulls various levers, this or that rate of economic growth will occur. But economic growth only occurs because entrepreneurs and people in the private sector do stuff, and because resources move into the hands of people who have a higher value use for them. The only thing government can do is create an environment in which that can happen. So my question, I guess, for National is, what business does the government having a growth target if we might all decide we just want to go down to the beach instead of working hard? And, of course, we haven't had anybody here talk about actually limiting growth, but from the point of view of those who are sceptical about growth or think there are constraints about growth, how do you achieve that as a matter of government policy without restricting freedom and preventing people from pursuing happiness in their own way?
The target and the goal of the National League Government's economic policy is to grow as quickly as we can so that we can climb up the OECD ladder. And it's not just about numbers, as I said, but about providing greater choices for what the government does with its money, but critically improving the material well-being of New Zealanders. And, as I said in my speech, we've got a long way to go, but I think we're heading in the right direction. Targets can be okay, though. I mean, we've set better public services targets, and one of the effects of setting targets on the public sector is it's focused a lot of minds on trying to solve problems. For example, getting welfare dependency down or increasing the numbers of kids leaving school with NCEA level 2, which we know is linked to better long-term employment prospects. We're trying to reduce the number of solo mums who are 18 years old, trying to raise kids without any education or without going into employment. So trying to set targets around those things, I think, can be useful. But we don't have a growth target. The target is grow as fast as we can.
Thank you, Chris. I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. I'm sure you will all agree with me that we've just heard a fantastic, thought-provoking debate, and I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. Now, whether you agree with the publication or not, we think you should read it. And to make it more affordable and to increase the sales, we have reduced the price for tonight to just $10. The moisturizer is sold separately. If you would like to purchase a copy, please talk to one of our staff members. We've got copies over there. And if you enjoyed tonight's event, please sign up to our mailing list to receive invitations to future events and, of course, to receive our weekly Insights newsletter. You can do this on our website, or you can just leave me your business card. And that's all for tonight. Once again, thank you all very much for attending, and I hope to see you at future events, and please join us for a drink now. Thank you.